Yo, what's up guys? This is Mike Troid, and today I'm coming at you with a different kind of video. As you can see, I have Pokemon Pocket over here to my side, and this is a game that's been out for about a week now, and I'm absolutely loving it and absolutely addicted to it. But today I wanted to show you a really cool Gengar EX control build that I've come up with. I've not seen a list like this anywhere else online, and I think it's really unique and a lot of fun to play, and actually pretty successful. So without further ado, we're going to dive into it. Now, Gengar EX is obviously something that players have tested and tried to make various different decks around, and while Gengar does have a very cool ability that locks your opponent out of supporters, it's very slow to set up, and I think that the mistake a lot of people are making is that they are not building their entire deck around this kind of like slow controlling game plan, and their deck functionally does nothing, which is why Gengar has not really had a presence in the meta thus far. I think this kind of changes that. This is a different take on how to play Gengar. This is a much slower deck, but it's very controlling, and I think it's very powerful. Now, just like in any other card game, if you're going to play control, you have to play it extremely well, or the deck will not do anything. You have to be very knowledgeable about the metagame and how to stop each of the individual strategies that your opponent is likely to be playing. So as soon as your opponent queues up and they flip over their first basic Pokemon, you have to understand what it is that you're playing against and how you can stop them in order to make the optimal plays. If you can do that, you'll probably win, but if you can't, then you're probably going to lose. So this deck does have a very high skill ceiling. As you can see, our main attacker is actually going to be Psyduck. There are no Golduck in this list whatsoever, but the Psyduck for one colorless energy, and that's really important, and I'll explain why in a minute, actually does 10 damage, and then more importantly locks our opponent out of supporters for the entirety of their next turn. This is really strong because if we are on the draw, which means that we're going second and we have the first energy attachment, from our very first turn onwards, we can lock our opponent out of supporters for the entirety of the game. Now, the reason that the colorless attack cost is important on Psyduck is because Gengar EX has a specified attack cost of 3 Psychic. That is extremely costly, slow to build up, and you cannot afford to be running multiple energy types in this deck. So the fact that Psyduck attacks for 1 colorless actually makes it a really good partner for Gengar. We can just focus on attaching psychic energies and not have to worry about the RNG of, multiple energy types. So most people know what Gengar does. It locks your opponent out of playing supporters passively while it is in the active position. So that's what we're going to be trying to build up to, while we also use Psyduck to control the early game. There's nothing really of note to say about the rest of the Gengar line. This Gengar is a one-of inclusion just in case you can't draw your Gengar EX early enough, or there's an opportunity to take a cheap knockout with this 1 energy attack. It is the same exact attack as Psyduck, but it does 50 damage instead of 10 damage, and it's also coming from a Psychic Pokemon, so if you're playing into like a fighting deck, for example, you can actually use this as a viable attacker. So this is more of a backup option for the Gengar EX, especially if you can't draw it until the very late game. Alrighty, so going down, you're going to notice this Pokemon here, Aerodactyl. It's a very odd inclusion, seemingly, but if you look at the list up here in the corner, we're also including a copy of Old Amber. Now, a lot of people by this point have caught on to the fact that Old Amber, or fossils in general, are really good techs in Stage 2 decks, because early in the game, they protect you from Sabrina. Let's say you're building up your Ghastly and your Haunter on the bench, and your opponent is trying to Sabrina around that, and knock it out before you can get it fully set up. The point of the fossils is so you have an extra benched Pokemon that you can present to your opponent. Yes, they will take a quick point for it by knocking it out, but you'll continue to build up the Pokemon you actually care about on the bench. So I've included that tech in this deck as well. Let's say we are on the play, which means that we don't get the first energy attachment, and your opponent actually gets to play the game a little bit. In that case, having a early game out to Sabrina is very important so that your Ghastly doesn't get knocked out right away. And Old Amber, conveniently, also has the secondary function of evolving into Aerodactyl. So I've included one in the list here, and this card actually comes up a lot more than I thought it would. For 2 colorless energy, again synergizing with the fact that we have to run mono psychic energy, you can actually shuffle your opponent's active Pokemon back into the deck on a coin flip. This is incredibly powerful against a lot of the strategies right now, where the opponent is trying to build up one powerful sweeper Pokemon like a Charizard EX, or a powered up Mewtwo EX, a Venusaur EX, a Dragonite. Lots of strategies revolve around this kind of play. Even this one, to be honest. So, by having Aerodactyl as like an option in your pocket, you can actually bring it out in the late game, you know, start attaching to the old Amber, building it up, and then surprisingly just, you know, auto-win the game by sweeping your opponent's best Pokemon that they've spent the whole game building up back into their deck. So I do like the one of Aerodactyl in this deck, in addition to the utility of the old Amber. Going down to the trainer cards, we have 2x speed. This is absolutely critical because, like I mentioned before, we want to be locking with Psyduck as soon as we can. And in order to do that, if we lead with Ghastly, we have to X speed out of the active and then attach to the Psyduck. So this just helps you to get more consistent starts. Past that, we have the very stereotypical 2 Pokeball and 2 Professor's Research. They're in every single deck, as they should be, and they are in this one as well. Now, I've also included 1 copy of Red Card here, and I understand that this card has been quite controversial in the game up to this point. And that's because some people think that this card is incredible and broken, and a lot of other people think that this card has no value whatsoever, and that it just functionally doesn't do anything other than shuffle, you know, 3 cards from your opponent's hand and give them a different 3 cards. That's what it does a lot of the time. But Red Card is actually critical in this deck because, as I've said, we're controlling their ability to play supporters for the entirety of the game, right? So we're using Psyduck from turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, maybe even using both copies of Psyduck if the first one gets knocked out, and then eventually using our Gengar and Gengar EX to further lock them out of supporters. So in a typical deck, which plays 6 or 7 supporters in this game, there are a lot of cards that they functionally can't play and will clog their hand. And once we get to the point that we have Gengar EX active, we want to use Red Card to shuffle that massive hand back into their deck, which number 1 will possibly limit their options, but number 2, and more importantly, it makes it so that all those supporters that have clogged their hand go back into their deck, and instead of drawing cards that may actually be useful, if their deck is now primarily supporters that can't even be played, and your opponent top decks them for turn, then they have functionally drawn nothing, right? So I think this card is less so of a disruption tool in this deck, and more so just kind of like a combo piece that you use once your Gengar is in the active position, and you've completely locked your opponent. So you're controlling both their ability to play cards, as well as just even draw cards in the first place. Past that, last card to talk about is Sabrina. This is a pretty typical inclusion in most decks, but unlike in other decks where we're using this to be aggressive and to move around our opponent's threats and take cheap knockouts on the bench, or even to target Pokemon that we really want to knock out before they can get set up, in this deck it is purely a defensive measure. Psyduck unfortunately only has 60 HP. It's very frail, it's very vulnerable, especially to Lightning, which is like the most prevalent deck in the metagame right now. So we use Sabrina to push our opponent's active back to the bench and force them to use resources like X speed and energy just to get back into the active and attacking. So if they have anything on their bench that we can take advantage of, like a heavy retreater, Sabrina is going to buy you a lot of time to get your own strategy online. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know if you have any constructive criticism or comments or questions. I'd be happy to answer any of those and kind of further explain how the deck works. But like I mentioned at the beginning, I've had a fair amount of success with this deck. It's actually worked surprisingly well, and I think it is particularly strong into a lot of the common meta strategies that we're seeing right now. So if you give this a shot, let me know, and I hope it goes well for you. Thanks for watching.